with a very special guest, Pastor Chase Davis, one of the pastors at the Well Church in Boulder, Colorado, and host of the Full Proof podcast, and former member of the Acts29 Church Network. And so that's actually what we're here to talk about. Where I discovered Chase recently was when he shared a very sad story of how his church was suddenly and forcibly removed from Acts 29 and released the phone recording of it all going down. And I listened to it, and from my perspective, at least, it was bad. It was really bad. I thought how they kicked you out, Chase, why they kicked you out, the lack of reason why they kicked you out, everything about it seemed to me wrong and infuriating. And you and the other pastor who was on the call, Matt, I thought did an amazing job. You kept your cool, you were kind, but held your ground. And it was, I just thought it was a great eye-opening experience to listen to. So I thought first we could kind of talk a little bit about the call and kind of what happened just briefly. And then we can rewind and talk on what exactly is Acts 29 and explain kind of the events that led up to this call. So kind of briefly explain what happened with the phone call and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so they summoned us to a Zoom meeting in January of 2023 to get on a Zoom meeting about an hour's heads up. And they said we would both want to be on it. So we're like, okay. So we got on the phone call, and they just kind of launched right into why we're being disfellowshipped from Acts 29, our church. And so we had, questions about that. What led to this? Who's making these decisions? That kind of stuff. One thing I was remiss we didn't ask that I needed to ask later was, is there a process of appealing this kind of decision? And there is none, come to find out.
Interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, the phone call itself, it was hard for me because Dave and Doug, I've talked with them on the phone before. Matt has talked to them on the phone before. So like this was kind of out of the blue.
And who is Dave and Doug?
Yeah, so Dave was a vice president in Acts 29. Same with Doug Logan. Both of them are no longer with the network. Dave left sometime in March, April, and Doug just announced this week that he's leaving the network as well. He's still, obviously, that doesn't mean they're leaving the relationships behind or anything like that. And I think Doug more clearly articulated why he's leaving his position in Acts 29. And Dave didn't publicly necessarily do that. So both of them are out of Acts 29. I remember getting off the phone with Matt, and I really have no animosity towards those men. The way I frame it is, and this is going to sound really calloused, but like if it came down to it and you and I were paid by our organization a really good salary, we have kids in college, we're trying to make ends meet, and our boss comes to us and says, you have to get this church out, or you have to remove them from fellowship, however you want to phrase it. And then, so you have a choice to make. Do I obey my boss or lose my job? Do I say no? And I think all of us would like to think I'm a righteous man, I would never do that. But at the end of the day, we got to feed our family. And so that's how I kind of understand it, because these men were friends to us. They were kind to us, even though we had some disagreements over the last few years. It's just funny to me that they're both out of the network now, because that's what I said when we got off the calls. Like, these guys are hirelings. They're going to be fall men, whether they mean to be or not. They're doing the dirty work for Brian Howard. So yeah, the call was disappointing. There wasn't a lot of clarity. I did want to understand. I still think the reasons for disfellowshipping were, not clear, and they could have been, they could have been more succinct, concise, more loving, but it is what it is. I think what confused a lot of people is, like you said, it was wrong. However, I don't view myself as like a victim or anything. And so I had a lot of people start following me on Twitter, and they're like, well, this guy is kind of like, it says some spicy things every once in a while, I guess. I just think it's
Yeah.
normal Christian discourse, but they're
Right.
like, he's not acting like a victim of spiritual abuse. And I'm like, yeah, I don't view myself as a victim of spiritual abuse. It's just an incompetent system, and it was done poorly. So that's how I kind of view it.
So they called you, or they send you an email,
Yeah.
and they give you almost no notice in advance. And you jump on this call, and I think one of the very first things they say on the call is like, you're going to be surprised by this, guys, but basically we're kicking you out. And so there was no notice, like you literally had no idea that this was going to happen. That was one of the things that I was curious about. Like, what was the, did you see this coming down the road, or was this literally like absolutely out of nowhere from your perspective?
Yeah, I've had that question too from other people messaging me or emailing me about it, because it's not that when we kind of thought it out in our head, if we
Mm-hmm.
start asking questions, if we start maybe challenging some concepts in a different way, it is possible that they would remove us. So it
Yeah.
wasn't outside the realm of possibilities. We knew that we were saying things that kind of cut against the grain of and challenged maybe some directional things that were going on in the network. So it wasn't surprising in that sense. It was surprising, particularly coming from those two men. And it was surprising because there was no prior conversation about, this being a natural consequence of any of our actions. So that's the surprise, is there was no warning. We didn't know we were being talked about by the board, and that this would turn out by from two people that we had come to trust in a certain way with certain things. We just had never heard that before. So yeah, it was surprising. It wasn't that it was out of left field, like like uh we had never talked to them, or we had never said anything, and we
Sure.
had never had prior conversations. It wasn't like a surprise attack like Pearl Harbor or something like that. um there was definitely you know ongoing dialogue with those two men particularly, and other men in the network. And so it wasn't a surprise in the sense that, like, what, how could this be? It was more like they never warned us. They never told us. We just didn't know that they were even considering this. We thought we were on good terms,
Yeah.
paying our dues, all this kind of stuff. So we thought we were good.
Yeah, that's the biggest shocker to me, that like, yeah, it's possible that this stuff could happen, but uh normal people who have, and not just like the men who are on the call necessarily, but the board or the whole system or whatever, like this is not normal. If somebody asks honest questions, and it doesn't seem like, you were trying to go out of your way to start fires, but you were curious, and we'll talk more about that later, and the kinds of things that maybe you were quote unquote guilty of that seem to be like totally normal average things to do. But would you say that those, like it, even though they never once, no matter how much you asked, actually gave you a reasonable answer as to why they were kicking you out of Acts 29, would you say that the actual reason was just because you were going against the grain too much with your conservative values, and they didn't like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that what I saw this week, from what little I saw at like the Southern Baptist Convention, for example,
Mm-hmm.
there was a speech given where a kind of a guy was, I guess it was a sermon. I just called a talk because it was at a convention and it wasn't really very expositional, especially this part where he started criticizing his opponents from the stage, all the while, saying we shouldn't criticize. And so, you
Right.
know, um, that kind of attitude is common in Acts 29. Um, and that was even back in the day with Morris Hill and Mark Driscoll at the helm. And so yeah, I think it has more to do with, like, we were obviously saying things. I was releasing content, writing articles that maybe didn't jive with the network uh, like it could have, and that's unfortunate because I tried to submit articles to the blog to show, like, hey, Matt Chandler said this here, and this other leader said this here, and here's what I think about that. And I agree with them, and here's how we can do what they're trying to advocate for. So I ended up putting that on our church blog, um, instead of, because they rejected it, and that's fine. I mean, people get rejected; it's not a big deal. But that's just kind of a little insight into, like, I was trying to provide an alternative voice. And that's what the thing that kept coming up in conversations with pastors still in the network today is, like, is there a place for people like us and churches like ours in the network who are willing to entertain ideas, or put forward a vision for Christianity that maybe is not big Eva, neutral public square, principled plurality, all these kind of concepts that are kind of givens in a lot of these, like the Gospel Coalition or other organizations. What if I say something different? Or what if I disagree? And so I think that's where it came from, is a lot of that, particularly calling into question, someone like Russell Moore, or publicly disagreeing with like someone like Tim Keller. These things are very frowned upon. You're not supposed to do that. And
Yeah.
and I understand why, because I used to be like that. So it's not that I can't fathom, why they have that attitude, but I just had to, for me, I repented of that attitude. It's not to say that I can't still have that attitude about some thinkers today, but it wasn't a point of pride for me when I look back on it. It's not something I look back on and be like, yeah, I'm really glad that I held Russell Moore to such a status in my own heart, where what he said kind of trumped Christian history, Christian doctrine, all this kind of. That's a really unhealthy way that we view pastors and other leaders. Can we respect people? Can we be respectful? Absolutely, but that doesn't mean they're beyond reproach, where I can't question or disagree even.
Hmm. So, what exactly is Acts 29? And then how did you originally get involved in it?
Yeah, so Acts29 is a church planting network. So there's a lot of them. You'll see Redeemer City to City is the PCA kind of version. They've got the Mission in North America. The MNA is their kind of church planting arm, and the SBC you'll get NAM, North American Mission Board, and then they have Send Network, which is their church planting ministry. You've also got other ones like Orchard Network, ARC, Association of Related Churches. So Acts29 kind of fits in that ecostream, um, or ecosystem, and they're connected with Exponential Conference. Connected, and by connected, I don't mean like an official connection, just like exponential, kind of like uh, that would be a place where you would find Acts 29 represented, right?
Hmm.
And Stetzer and all these church planting thinkers. So Acts 29 is a network of church plants. There's big discussion over whether it's denomination or not under a classical definition. Um, they typically don't even entertain that question just because they want to stick to like, we're a network. That's what we are. But they do have a confession of faith that all Acts29 pastors have to sign on to. I don't remember signing on to that back in 2011, but they now use the LaSalle confession of faith, I think it's called, um, which is riddled with a lot of social justice stuff once you look into it. And so that was kind of news to me in 2020, 2021 when I found that out.
Hmm.
But back in 2011, we joined because it was a brotherhood of like minded churches that had similar convictions on certain key doctrines and matters of Christian practice. So, complementarianism, Calvinistic in their soteriology, continuationists when it comes to things of the spirit, although I think there's a lot more cessationists in the network than they might realize. In fact, one continuationist left last year. Sam Storms left last year because it wasn't continuationist enough. And so, that's always an interesting one. They're missional, so they want to think like missionaries. All these things were very like, and in many ways still are formational for our church, in terms of what we believe, how we operate. Now, I would say we've matured over time and how we apprehend those certain convictions and even refine them, or would maybe redefine them. Um, so that's why we joined back in the day. The benefit of joining back in the day was brotherhood. So out here in Colorado, those kinds of churches are hard to find. And I would find myself in prayer meetings or fellowship or at seminary with people who had fundamental disagreements on complementarianism or Calvinism. And so that it takes for me, maybe you're not a Christian who's like, reformed or anything like that. And so maybe you don't care as much, but I cared. I still kind of care a lot. If I'm going to go pray with somebody, how are we praying? How are we thinking about Christian doctrine? How are we understanding the church? These things matter to me as a pastor, and I think they should matter to a lot more people. But I found it really hard to find fellowship because, for me and my wife, we're young, planting a church. We're trying to figure out how to do ministry. And it was hard for me to like enter into fellowship with other churches in the area if I knew we disagreed on these core convictions, where the culture's pressing really hard on. And so when you got an Acts Shrine, you got a brotherhood where it's like we've already got that trust established. Like
Hmm.
all those things are kind of like agree. We now let's talk about other things. So what we would often talk about is church planning strategies. What it became is kind of a network that was like an incubator, a mastermind group, is what they were kind of doing with the cohort model, where you could meet other pastors who grew a church really big or a small pastor kind of in a rural context. and we could all like sharpen each other. And so it became very focused on church planting and how to church plant effectively. So effectiveness and leadership became really big things, especially over the last 5 years. But originally it was brotherhood. You didn't get any money when you joined Acts 29. So it wasn't like with these other networks, they're going to give you seed money or something like that. There's no money back in the day. And so you're joining it for a lot of branding, and a lot of like, hey, if you move to a new city, look up an Acts 29 church and
Mm.
you'll kind of find a church like ours. What we found though is that, um, very quickly it was like, well, there's a lot of different churches. Like I remember sending one of my best friends from high school and college to a church in Houston. He wasn't at my church, but I was like, you should go look up an Acts 29 church. And he went and he described it, and it was very emergent church style worship, right? And so even within Acts 29, you would get very different approaches to Sunday morning worship, how
Mm.
they did mission. Some churches were like, we don't meet on the third Sunday of every month. We serve the community. And it's like, well, that's different. And so
Wow.
it's a very broad coalition, but at least on those core assumptions, you get a brotherhood because it was, those things are and still are important matters of theological discourse.
Mm. So it sounds like it used to be a lot better than it is now. So what happened over the years, and what made you come to realize some of the issues?
Yeah. So what happened over the years, gosh, I don't even know that well. A lot of the stories I got were from Darren Patrick. He was on our oversight board until he took his own life in 2020. We'd known him for a couple of years. I think our church was the first Acts 29 church he preached out after his dismissal. Whether that was rushed restoration or not, I'm going to leave that in the Lord's hands. But we had always kind of had a heart for pastors who are kind of on the down and out, who have been hurt. Ministry can be really hard. And so a pastor like him, we're like, he has a gifting. He seems to be on a path of repentance. He's, pursuing his wife, loving his wife, and he has a lot to offer. And so we became friends with him. What I came to find via him and via other sources is that the leadership culture in Acts 29 is very connected with kind of big evil way of doing things, which is a very business mindset, pragmatics. So whether it's Christianity Today, Exponential, Leadership Network, Gospel Coalition, a lot of these people are very well connected. And
Mm.
then you get into seminaries where a lot of these organizations kind of get connected with seminary students, and they offer what they cast to a bunch of seminary men and ministry minded men is, here's a place where you can come and we can kind of credential you, give you respect, we can float your ideas, come play in our game, and then you can be platformed or whatever. And so Acts 29, what happened is it started, I mean, gosh, Driscoll's I don't think we want to get into Driscoll, but it's a complex vignette of a certain era of the young restless reformed. And when he was kind of growing and prestige, that led and revealed a lot of character issues in his
Mm.
own ministry, as it does. Pace and pressure of ministry reveals all sorts of things in pastors' hearts, um, including the lack of a pace and pressure. If they don't get the respect they think they deserve or whatever it may be, that's going to reveal something too. But especially if you have success in ministry, that is going to reveal something. And so what was revealed with Driscoll was a very angry, person. And so they kind of turned away from that or they attempted to turn away from that when they removed his church from the network, all that kind of stuff. And so that was 2014, somewhere back then. And they intentionally started, doing a 180. We want to be known as mature, and the way they define mature is being winsome and nice and
Yeah.
not being like that. But the irony is, if you listen to Matt Chandler was the president until last fall. His sermons are very angry. He still yells and is very intense. And look, like I can do that too. I'm not saying that's always out of bounds,
Sure.
but it's just funny coming from somebody who's very, heavy emphasis on we're not angry. It's like,
Yeah. And
I
just
think you
like
are.
when they on the phone call criticize you, and Matt Chandler says, it's like it's not okay to be angry or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, It's like they know it's okay to be angry, but the question is, what is it okay to be angry towards? It's okay for them
Exactly.
to be angry towards the conservatives, and
Yep.
it's not okay for you to be angry towards the liberals, right?
Right. Yeah, and I would even broaden it towards just angry at like they would call it culture warring because a lot of the conservative liberal paradigm is really trapped in a liberal democratic discourse that's very modern. And so they wouldn't I don't know if they probably wouldn't be able to articulate that. And that's not me speaking down on them. That's just like a lot of these people think like, well, you got hit out because you're too conservative. I know that two guys on the call are very conservative, so it's not so much but it is very like a slanted like being. You
Mm-hmm.
can be angry at certain things, and it's a very David French kind of like we got to beat ourselves up. Judgment starts at the household of God. We can never critique the culture. We can never critique anything outside of us. The only thing we can do there is find common ground and try to like show them how Jesus is better, and so that's very much in the water there.
Interesting. So so one of the big issues that I'm aware of in Acts 29 that persists to this day is social justice. When did you start noticing that enter the water? Was that kind of part of the your considerations when so one of the issues I know that they have with you in the call was that you they they said you publicly critiqued
Yeah.
you had what did he say, you had like an atmosphere of a bunch of words that are
Yeah.
like not nonsense, and then you didn't ever do any public critique as far as you knew, but
Right.
in just in internally, uh, were you aware of the social justice issues, or like what were some of the issues that you maybe had internally that you were having private conversations about and trying to reform the network, just through your personal relationships once you became aware of those, that maybe eventually they became aware of and started having a bigger problem with you?
Yeah, for sure. So I wasn't aware of it until 2020. That's how kind of blind I was. So anybody who kind of trusts me as a leader should know that like I also was very captured in the sense that
Yeah.
like prior to 2020, we were trying to do the diversity thing.
Mm.
Um, and we are trying to do it in a way that like that would please the world, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
That's really hard to say out loud because that's not a good thing. But we are also trying to harmonize it with the biblical text and what we see in Revelation with nations and all this kind of stuff. So it wasn't like we were just aiming to please the world. We were trying to understand the cultural pressure for a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff, understand it within the biblical framework. What we were getting and what we just believed was fine at the time was a lot of Eric Mason and a lot of these other thinkers pushing diversity in a certain direction and
Mm-hmm.
decrying certain issues. Um, and so we just kind of went along with it because we were like, well, what they're telling us is that white people don't know and that we shouldn't speak and that, we need to do our homework and we need to go do research. And this was happening all throughout the late 2010s, 2016, 2017, 2018. And we were willing to go so far. Like we read Trillia Newbell's book on diversity with our church. And we were like, we want to understand if all these people are saying every church needs to be like multi-ethnic in every context. We're like, okay, what does that mean for us at the Well Church in Boulder, which is 90% white? What does it mean to be diverse? And so at the end of the book, we were like, good book. We seem to be diverse. Like, okay, but that was never enough. And so
Yeah.
we still held a lot of like caution about it because it felt weird. Um, it
Mm.
wasn't until 2020 that it like something broke for a lot of people, not just us, but for a lot of people. And I had to go in my own heart and my own mind in turn, not in like a secular would, but like re-examine the biblical text and the assumptions I've brought to the biblical text in my theological framework, and I needed to undo a lot of the stuff that I had brought in to what I believed to be Christian. So
Mm-hmm.
whether it was diversity matters or other issues, the way we do mission. And so with BLM and all this kind of stuff going on in the culture, it really started to expose in Acts 29 certain ways of talking about matters that I now believe to be very neo-Marxist, critical race theory. All these kind of issues are very prevalent in the waters of Acts 29. They have been for years, and I didn't
Yeah.
know it because I didn't have,
Mm.
as a church planter, just busy starting a family, starting a church, doing seminary. So I didn't have a lot of time to dig into neo-Marxism. Wasn't that interested in at the time. But then all of a sudden in 2020, I was like, well, I'm at home. And let's do it because this is a big issue. And so once I did that, I was like, this is a real problem. And so they started getting on phone calls saying, America was founded on racism and lies and white supremacy, and if you voted for Trump, you're a white supremacist, and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, well, this is weird. And so I
Yeah.
started asking questions because I was like, I don't agree with that. In fact, it's a funny episode on my podcast, Foolproof Theology. If you go, there's an episode called Boom Roasted. And I tear apart an article I wrote back in 2014. I think it was after Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown. Um, and it was published by an Acts29 pastor who was an Acts29 pastor at the time, saying, look how good of an ally Chase is. And I was like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread that on air, and I'm going to say how I have
Wow.
changed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I
Wow.
think that would be helpful for my church and just a helpful exercise for me to publicly own what I said.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's a really, but yeah, so 2020 was the kind of time it broke. And that at that point, I started asking questions. And when those questions weren't answered with transparency and honesty, like, we just disagree on this, but you're still welcome here. Like, that would have been enough. Like, we're a big tent network. We're going to agree to disagree. But then they
Yeah.
kept promoting only certain things, Ivermex, Kendi, all this kind of resources. All of a sudden, I'm going, you guys don't seem trustworthy. In fact, now I'm going to start asking questions in a different way. How do people get
Yeah.
into leadership? And how's our money being
Yeah.
used that we send you every month? And so that's kind of the direction the conversation started having 2020 to 2023.
Interesting. So backing up just a little bit, you said in 2020 the switch flipped. I had kind of the same experience where I just started becoming aware of a lot of this stuff at the same time, and it was because of the pandemic for me, and more outrageous things started happening, like government tyranny and all the rest of it, and like churches closing and all that, and that was major enough that I started looking into this stuff and doing my research, and I realized, oh, there's all this other stuff that's actually connected to all these things, like critical race theory and social justice and whatever. So was that the thing that flipped the switch for you also, the
Uh,
pandemic?
the pandemic definitely had had a big effect on how I think about it because at the time I still am, I'm pursuing a PhD in church history, and so I was very interested in how previous generations have approached this.
Mm,
And so I started writing a couple articles up at Mere Orthodoxy on the pandemic and that kind of thing, and how basically public health became a leviathan that needs to be slain. I think that's a direct quote from one of the articles. And so that was something that definitely was a dividing line within the network. Because if you
mm.
ask questions on like Acts29 channels and you questioned, like, hey, should we be doing this? All of a sudden it would be vitriol. How dare you question? People are dying. It's like, wow, okay, like,
Wow.
I'm just trying to offer a different point of view. Obviously, that's you know an emotional response to something I'm just having a reasonable dialogue about. And a lot of pastors went through hell in 2020 dealing with this stuff because their own church split. You'll have pastors that try to keep the middle and please everybody. And by please, I don't mean they're trying to do that in some kind of negative way necessarily. They're just trying to keep their church together in unity, right? Some may be motivated by man worship for sure, but some, honestly, good pastors were just trying to keep it together. And so, yeah, I think the pandemic definitely was the first prick. And with both the pandemic and BLM, critical race theory, all this kind of stuff, those first started in my heart and in my
Mm,
mind in terms of what have I believed about death? What have I believed about public health? What have I believed about how we trust government and where our government is? What have I believed about race relations? What have I? And so it all started with a reevaluation of my own convictions. The problem with me is I'm not willing to just like, I'm willing to have a conversation as I learn. And so, like, as I'm going, I'm going to share my thoughts on what I'm learning. And that may not be perfect yet because none of us are perfect. And so, maybe sometimes I said it clumsily or I was too forward. But a lot of that stuff, like, you did come online with the pandemic, especially being in Colorado and Boulder County, one of the most liberal counties in the state, a source of pride for our county, by the way.
yeah.
Um, as we started asking questions and our church was wrestling with, like, what do we do? We were just like, yeah, we're not doing that. But as far as Action goes, they were kind of very hands off. Other than like, you can't go on cohorts. Well, all you do if you can't go on a cohort was like, cool, I'm going to text my friends and we're just going to go on vacation. It's not a cohort anymore. So, like, we were willing to do that kind of stuff, which I think irked some leaders because they didn't
Yeah.
want us to meet. They were like, we're not having conferences. We're not doing anything. Everything's over Zoom. And we're like, well, I want to go to Arizona and hang out with some pastors. and get prayer and equipping and fellowship. So I'm just going to do that on my own dime, you know, and have some
Hmm.
fun. So I think that may have irked him. I don't know. Like, but that definitely was an issue that came up in 2020 that set me off in a direction. Like I had never heard the word theonomy before 2020. And I have 2 degrees from a Christian seminary. And so, you know, the fact one that that's really unsettling for me because it's like that's a big issue in 20th century evangelicalism,
Yeah.
right? And it's a springboard to bigger issues in church history, and how we approach God's law. And so I was trying to discern all of that out of it, just kind of a general sense of like this can't be reality. This dystopian world where everybody's, you know, masked up everywhere into a restaurant. They sit down, they're unmasked, they're eating. Like this seems like insane to me. And so I was just trying to study more, and it pointed me towards a lot of different really good resources, really good connections, really good people who actually, there's a lot of Christians out there who are very in line with Christian orthodoxy and Christian practice throughout church history.
Hmm. So a lot of these questions that you started asking, and these very reasonable thoughts, and you know, true and good thoughts, and questions and resistance that you were having, uh, irked the network. And I heard you mention something like you said you criticized Russell Moore at some point. What did you say about Russell Moore?
I guess I could go find it on Facebook because I can't remember exactly
Oh,
what I
okay.
said, but I remember that he basically said something publicly, and I was like, "That's enough. Like, I cannot even associate with this guy." I had publicly kind of celebrated him on Facebook constantly in my
Yeah.
church, and so I just kind of offered like, "Hey, like in the past, I've endorsed Russell Moore. At this point, I don't anymore, and here's why. You know, I don't view him as a good faith kind of dialogue guy. He doesn't seem to, you know, have it all together in terms of Christianity. So that was about what I said. Um, you know, I think I quote tweeted him a couple times on Twitter. Uh, you know, so like that's what it came down to. But yeah, he was like he spoke at the 2019 Acts29 National Conference and a global conference in Orlando.
Hmm.
He's at Ray Orland's church. You know, he's at Christianity Today. He's friends with Brian Howard. And so, unbeknownst to me, I'm like just trying to publicly distance myself for my own church's sake, for my own ministry's sake. And they view it as like, you know, you're hurting my friend. You're,
Yeah.
you know, and so they take it very personally.
Yeah, I've personally seen that kind of vitriol in response to, like, oh, you're criticizing some guy that I like for a very legitimate reason, but it doesn't matter the reason. Like, you can't criticize somebody that I like because
Yeah.
the what they call quote unquote Christian unity kind of trumps all other virtues, it seems to me, in a lot of cases. And that's so nasty and twisted and wrong. And yet, like you said, you could be defending your own congregation as a good shepherd ought to, and this network will attack you for it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. Somebody messaged you, and you talked about that on the phone call. But so all of these things kind of came to a head with this phone call that they didn't give you any prior warning for. But like you said earlier, you know you could see how this was possible that this phone call would happen. Although you would think that, you know, reasonable, good human beings would give you some kind of warning, or give you, you know, say like, you know, hey, if you do this, if you get 3 strikes, you're out. You know, but they didn't let you know any of that just because of your questioning how they handle social justice and these other things. They all of a sudden do this phone call. So I'm interested in hearing your perspective on what they were telling you was the reason that you were being kicked out for. And I thought your response to that was awesome through the phone call, like I said. But talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the reasons at first were they're not moving forward with churches that can't wholeheartedly support the network. Um, you know, we've been combative and critical in nature. That was the beginning of the phone call. We've been combative and critical in nature, both of which, you know, it's not surprising. I've joked over the last few years that this verse about being pugnacious or pastors being a fighter, this is going to be turned against pastors who question leaders
Hmm.
because they're going to say you're not qualified anymore if you display any type of uh, instinct that does fight. You know, pastors should fight for the truth. They should defend the truth.
Yeah.
And so what that's going to be twisted against pastors to give grounds for disqualification. What,
Mhm.
of course, that's not what the text is implying. They're twisting the text to suit their own purposes. But that was the first part, was combative and critical. I think it's funny because I'm like, well, I mean, you're being combative too. Like, you're
Right.
obviously being a
You're
man.
combating me right
Yeah.
now.
So
Like we're
like,
combating each other. So who's, you
yeah,
need a higher standard, and that higher standard needs to be scripture, but
exactly.
they're the ones in charge. And so like you said on the phone call, it's like you have the power to kick me out, but like, if the issue is just where I'm being disagreeable, you're being disagreeable.
Yeah, right. Yeah. What's the
It
standard?
doesn't make any sense.
There's no process to discern these matters biblically. Critical. Yeah, I mean, everyone, hopefully everyone's a critical thinker. I know I can be a bit more critical. Like my friends know I'm a bit more cynical. I wish I wasn't. I think a good pastor is more hopeful. I'm learning and maturing to be more hopeful and joyful in the Lord, as all Christians should be, but especially a Christian pastor. But I know I can be a bit critical, but I don't think either of them, those weren't those weren't elaborated on. What they quickly pivoted to was your public critique of the network,
Yeah.
to which I just simply asked where, because I knew uh, the culture in Acts 29. This is what's so weird about it, man. Is like, you're in a culture that's very interesting. I'm not even going to say it's wrong necessarily. Where if you say something of public critique against leaders or the direction, you will be cast out. Um, Now, I'm not going to get in. There's a lot you could say about that, because, like, we all love the idea of a modern world where we're tolerant of a diversity of ideas. And so it's not that it's necessarily like, I get there's a level of respect. There's a level of like, you shouldn't publicly critique all the time. You shouldn't try to, some of my friends in actually, and they're like, you just seem like you want to burn it all down. I'm like, that's not the goal. The goal is to critique helpfully to lead to reform. But with their accusation of public critique, I intentionally avoided ever tagging or mentioning Acts 20 on Twitter
Yeah.
or on Facebook, because I knew that that was the kind of culture that was set up, that you were not allowed. So I intentionally avoided that.
Hmm.
Um, did I question gospel centered and what it means today? Did I question missional and what it means today? Absolutely. I've written articles on that. I've done episodes on my podcast about that. But have I publicly critiqued the network? No, it's not there. So then it goes into, the examples that were, if I can't remember if they gave any examples at all, but quickly it became private conversations. And
Yeah,
it's like,
gave some examples, or you or Matt did,
yeah,
and then they were like, yeah, that.
yeah. And I'm like, those are private conversations. So I don't know what we're talking about here. If you're wanting to kick me out for private conversations we've had, which up to this point, we've always ended amicably as brothers in Christ, prayed for one another. I've received no indication that I violated some terms of arrangement.
Yeah.
If there was something in the statement we sign every year, you will not publicly critique the network, like, then yeah, I will have violated that. To go back to the point I was making, like in a church covenant, a lot of churches have used church covenants for their membership for hundreds of years. In a church covenant, oftentimes it'll say to the member, you will not go against the teaching of so and so church, or you will not publicly go against the teaching of so and so church. Clear as, that's a pretty clear standard. If you're publicly celebrating abortion, or you're publicly celebrating these things, you're going against the faith that we agree as a church community.
Mm.
And so if there was something like that that they could point to, I could actually agree with that. But
Sure.
there is no standard. It's literally just vibes and feelings,
Yeah.
and if you,
It's what
for a
the
person,
board agrees on behind the curtains.
yes, behind the hidden curtain that no one can talk to the board. No one can get on the phone with the board. If you ask for an email from the board, you're not going to get one. You're going to get one from a hireling that they have. And so they operate in secrecy, and they operate behind closed doors and make decisions. And gosh, it's so bad. Here, I mean, like the perfect example is you've got there's a network of churches in Fort Worth, Plant Fort Worth, and a lot of them are Acts 29 churches. Some of them are really good. So this isn't to put a target on Plant Fort Worth. Plant Fort Worth, though, is having Ed Stetzer and Eric Mason come teach their church planters about ministry today. Ed Stetzer attends and is a leader at Mariners Church in California, who has Christine Kane, a female preacher on staff. And so to me, it's just so hard because it's like clear, it's like plain, it's
Yeah.
like this is not good. And you've got Eric Mason, I'm sorry, Ed says they're going over to Australia to preach to that pastor church who promoted transgender ideology. And then you've got Matt Chandler going over there. And so you've got this
Yeah.
super kind of elite class, or they think they're elite, class of like Christians who publish books and get on Right Now Media and get interviews and are celebrated by Christianity Today, and they all go to the same dinners, go to the same parties, hang out together. And you know what? Good for them. Okay, good for them. This is not a populist rant. This is like every culture is going to have elites. It's just the
Hmm.
elites we have in evangelicalism are terrible, and
Yeah.
they're self-serving, and they're more interested in going on cruises to teach their latest book than they are to actually minister to the people who are under their care and who they're responsible for in their organization. And so, yeah, it's not good. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. Man, like I said before, when I was listening to the phone call and the lack of reasons that they were giving you for why they were kicking you out, you ask them over and over and over, and you ask them in different ways, and you were very, I thought, clever in the ways that you were trying to get the information out of them, and they just kept, they were kind of like twisting it to make it seem like they have evidence, or they were saying like, well, you know what you did, which is, it's crazy. That's not how adults act.
Right.
And you were like, no, I don't know, tell me what I did.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it boils down to they disagree with you and they wanted you out, and there was no policy reason whatsoever. It was just the board, which is, even though Matt Chandler is no longer the president, he's still on the board. I
He's the
looked at the
chair. Yeah.
yeah, I looked at the Acts29 website, and he's not even on the website anymore, but he's still very much in leadership, one of the people in charge in Acts29. But he's like embarrassing now to put there because of his awkward conversation with that lady in his church.
Right.
Man, so it's like there's all these connections that I'm noticing in Acts 29 based on what you're saying. Like, even with, so is Ed Stetzer Acts 29?
No,
Okay.
but he was on the original founding documents. So
Oh,
he was on the original board with Driscoll and a few other guys that started Acts 29. So he has deep ties to the network. He's widely respected.
yeah,
Um, Same thing with Christianity Today, Wheaton, just all it's like I feel like I'm looking at a board on the wall and I can see it. I can see all these people relating to one another. I don't
yeah,
blame them. It's good to have friends. It's good to have friends in high places. Congrats. But when you're behaving in a duplicitous manner and you're not transparent and you're not just being honest, uh, and you do this kind of stuff, it looks real bad. It looks real bad.
it does. Yeah, absolutely. And stuff like this just proves, more and more, and it hopefully stuff like this makes it more clear to people who are in Acts 29, or people who are considering getting in Acts 29, to say like, there's a lot of corruption, like deep, serious corruption in in things like Acts 29, but also in all of these networks and things that they are connected with, like these people they're connected with, and these like the SBC they have this close relationship with, and
Right.
and then if you look at those other organizations, there's deep corruption in those, because like you said, the evangelical elites right now in our nation are bad news. They're
Yeah.
so bad. It's corrupting Christianity. Like, these people are driving the direction of Christianity in America right now.
Yeah.
And so no surprise why we're in the situation we're in as a nation, I think.
Right. I agree. Yeah. And I've always dreamed, like part of the reason I started my podcast, part of the reason I started speaking more publicly is like, I'm going to say what I wish they would say. Because if we had elites in evangelicalism in the church today, and they all were to get, just be like, we're going to use every means at our disposal to resist the spirit of the age. We're going to put in journals. We're going to put statements on our seminary web pages. We're going to put articles on the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today. We're going to get interviews with the New York Times, Washington Post, and we are going to be in lockstep on biblical orthodoxy on sexual ethics and how bad it is to mutilate the gender of children. We're just going to be impassioned about that because it is killing people. It is destroying humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Man, like guess what? I can delete my Twitter. Like I don't feel any need to be a voice because I've got so much air support, so much artillery power fighting. I can join up with that. But right now the guns are silent. They're
Yeah.
not interested in that. And so yeah, it's not a good position. It makes me really sad. And I could just go down the list of David Platt and all these guys who it's like,
Yeah.
if they would all just get on the same page on these matters and speak truthfully, biblically, informed from Christian history, do you know that could be a source of renewal in not just the church but our nation. That could be a source for great good. And so it's so sad to me to see the watchers of the wall abandoning their post, that we don't have sons of Issachar, men who are ready for the time to meet the battles of our day. They're just not there. And so it's super depressing when you put it that way, but it's how I kind of see things.
Yeah. And that's how I see things too. I think that's reality, and to see it any other way is just not making sense of the things that's happening clearly around us, and that has been happening for ever since before even we became aware of them. But so because of the sad state of Acts 29, what what do you think churches should do who are currently in Acts 29? And what do you think churches should do who are maybe considering getting into Acts 29? Is there hope to reform it, or are they being kind of hampered in their ministry too much, and should they just jump ship?
Yeah, so I'll do the second question, then go back to the first. So for churches that are
Okay.
thinking about 20 Acts 29, I would stay far away. You
Mm.
are giving your money to an organization that's uninterested, that doesn't have your best interests at heart. They're going to speak out of both sides of their mouth, say they care about pastors, all the while they use your money to take extravagant trips to Cancun and other places, which, you know what, God bless, have fun. I would love to go on vacation there with my wife. It's not wrong to go to Cancun. It's how the money is being utilized for church planting efforts. Less than around 3% of the annual budget of Acts 29, which is around $7 and $8 million. Only 3% of that actually goes to church planting or church plants. The rest of it gets distributed amongst 45 staff and executives and all and conferences and all this kind of stuff.
And
And
their
so you,
vacations.
yeah, and so you're only giving money to make these people more powerful, and they're not interested in hearing from you if you disagree with them. And so that's not a culture you want to join as a church plant. Find another local church that you can partner with that maybe is not as aligned as you, but you can actually see their face, and you know where you stand with them. Find other networks because this is not one for you. In
I want to
terms of,
reiterate that
oh,
point
go ahead.
just to make sure that everybody understands. So every church has to give how much of your church's money had to go to Acts 29 each year?
So it used to be 3% and went down to 2%. 3%. They used to do it by regions. So in the
Yeah.
West it was 3, every other region was 2, and they recently did 2% of your annual budget goes to Acts 29 Central. You're supposed to allocate 8%. So a total of 10% of your money is supposed to go to church planting. And so the other 8% of that 10, you're supposed to take upon yourself to either put aside or invest in other church plants. So it's on your own with the other 8%, but the 2% goes to central.
And so of all that money that Acts 29 makes, uh, 3% of their entire income of member money, of church money, of tithes, essentially, that they're making, 3% of all of the money that Acts 29 makes from all of the churches in their network actually goes to planting churches. And they are a church planting network, right? Is that what you
Yeah.
said?
Yeah. So
Okay.
like
And so
the what
97% of their money that they make as a church planting network goes towards paying staff and vacations to Cancun and conferences and other fun, cool stuff.
sure. Yeah, and the way they would spin it, if you want to steel man them, is all of their activities that they do are to further church planting.
Yeah,
So they're
right.
going to say
Yeah.
100% of their budget goes to church planting as a
Of
theme,
course.
right? But
Sure.
only 3% goes through the organization to an actual church plant. And so the rest, yeah, the 97% is retained for the building up of the central organization and the bureaucrats and the people that are there running the website and paying a PR firm and all this kind of stuff. So the rest of the 97% that is made up of their budget is going to those kind of activities.
Hmm. So if a church is trying to join Acts 29, don't stay far away.
Don't.
What about the
Yeah.
churches who are in Acts 29?
Well, it depends on what you want. If you are happy I guess stay. If you are content with kind of what is, then yeah, you're pretty, set. But there's a lot of dissatisfied pastors in Acts 29 right now, and a lot of dissatisfied pastors who I wouldn't think would be dissatisfied because they're kind of like going along with the woke stuff. They're kind of going along with that. But when this video came out or the phone call came out, they were like very deeply disturbed, and so they're starting to ask questions. The challenge that any pastor within Acts 29 is going to have is they have no power. I remember getting on the phone with a friend and I was like, I really want to help Acts 29 reform or at least clarify, from what little power I have. And he's like, well, what's your position in the network? And I was like, I have none, like, cause I'm a church, we're pastors of a local church in the network. We have no vote. We have no, there's no, nothing that we can do to stop anything. And so the only thing in that kind of situation when you are powerless is to either become a troublemaker for good and start asking really direct questions. The problem you're going to have is you're going to need to get those in writing because right now the strategy is the same strategy they used in Mars Hill. And I know this from some sources is that the strategy of Mars Hill, when people would ask questions, is let's get on the phone. And so they would never reply in writing. They would never put in writing what they believe. They would
So
always
that's
say,
an intentional strategy. It's not just because, I mean, what they say is they want to be personable and they want to talk to you
yeah,
in person, but the that's a real strategy so that they don't get anything in writing for legal reasons.
yeah, not just for legal reasons, but they can't be held accountable,
Yeah.
right? Because
Oh
if you
my
put something in writing, it's
gosh.
out there. And so, like,
Wow.
you need to get it in writing and you need to start causing some trouble in a good way, a way that's Christian, but you need to be doing it because if you don't, then you either just need to leave, like, because like nothing's going to change. There's a guy, a pastor 2 weeks ago, a month ago, I don't remember when, he sent a letter in to the board asking about our situation. He shared the letter with me, making sure it was truthful. And I was like, yeah, and he was like, here's the reply I got. And it was just PR, nonsense. Thank you for your inquiry. We take all questions seriously. We are always trying to get better. Blah, 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 blah. Nothing. It was just PR nonsense.
Wow.
And so, like, they're attacked right now. And, and this is how it's going to continue to be unless something big happens, is to ignore, is to just be like, we're not going to do anything about this.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't blame them in one sense. I mean, I'm a pastor of a relatively, small church in a liberal county in Boulder, Colorado. These guys are rich, powerful, well connected. The strategy they have is the strategy of the world, which is, just ignore it. It's just noise, stay on mission, and
Yeah.
don't address it. And that's what they're going to do unless there's a coalition built within the network that is aligned to confront the board. The board, especially Brian Howard, these are the people that need to be confronted and they need to own what they've done and
Yeah.
where they're at. And if they want to keep walking down this path of compromise, then make them say it. But if they want to change, make them say it. But if they don't say, we're going to change some policies, we're going to do things differently, here's the mistakes we've made. If there's no ownership, no responsibility, nothing's going to change. And so it's a really hopeless situation. Now, some people are like, why do I care? It's Acts 29. I've got my own local church. Why should I care about these big things? Right. And to frame it rightly, Acts 29 is not that big. It's like 500 churches in the US. I think they're losing churches every week at this point, but it's not in the grand scheme of things. The budget of NAM is like 10 times bigger than Acts 29, but they have a
Sure.
lot of like influence and power. And so I think it's right for a pastor to care about Acts 29's future, especially if you're in it. One, because you're giving your church's money to it. So you should care. You should take some ownership over that. And two, because in our day and age, institutions are collapsing left and right. And as we build new institutions that replace the old ones, some are going to need to go away. Maybe Acts 29 is one of them. But I also think there's a willing, worthwhile cause to reform institutions that have existed for 20, 30 years and try to save them from cultural capitulation and cowardice, to try to reform them and move them into a new era where we continue to make disciples and glorify God. So I think it's worth it. Some pastors disagree with me on that, and that's totally fine. Some pastors have called me and be like, "I'm just out. I'm not even going to try." I'm like, "I don't blame you." Like it's an uphill battle all the way. So that's what I would say to current Acts 29 pastors.
And another thing, if you stay in Acts 29, is you are funding critical race theory. and
Yeah.
and that's not to say if I were an Acts 29 pastor, I would say like, yeah, we gotta leave. But that's a consideration. Your money that your church members are paying is going towards evil things. But also, I think something that like good faithful Christians are really bad at, and I think it's for a good reason, is we we want to trust people, and we want to trust the system we're in, and we want to go through all the correct avenues. Like we want to submit our nice polite emails to the PR firm that's going to give us a stupid answer. And
Yeah, right. Yeah.
we're not going to try to force our way to the board that's inaccessible and up on their high tower. And so we're like, well, I tried, I can't do anything. But so I think in general, not just in the Acts 29 situation, but in general, I think good faithful Christians need to learn to fight more in whatever situation they're in. Not necessarily that they have to always fight if they're in a situation like this, but if they are, they need to be willing to fight to reform, because that's what's necessary to reform things like this. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that unsettles a lot of the former generation of reformed kind of boomers
Yeah.
because they came from a generation that was very schismatic,
Mm,
very
mm,
like divided. They would divide over all sorts of things. You don't line up on this point of doctrine, therefore we divide,
yeah.
and like they knew how to fight, but they would
Sure.
fight not for unity. They would kind of fight for like separation. And so to be clear, when we're saying fight, I totally agree with you. What we're fighting for is reform and unity. And even if we disagree on some secondary or tertiary issues doctrinally, how do we define unity? We're fighting for clarity of doctrine, and that doesn't mean we have to fight about everything all the time. It doesn't mean we have to break the word of God by any means. We don't have to become some version who's just angry, egomaniac who's always fighting. But a lot of Christians haven't been taught how to fight well. They haven't been taught how to pick up the sword and just do battle, both with the demon kind of like worship in our culture, but also within the church. How do we fight amongst one another in a brotherly way in order to build one another up, not tear one another down? There is a time for dividing. There's a time for separation. There's a time for organizations burning down. Totally fine with that. That's within God's sovereignty, and that may be His will. But if we're going to be reformers, we're going to fight for unity and clarity on what's clear in the Word of God. And if we can't agree on that, if we can't agree on the authority of the Word of God, then we're kind of doomed. But I would rather be in fellowship with somebody who's like, no, we agree on this confession of faith. We agree on this statement of faith this church has. And we're willing to fight on these matters, and we're willing to fight for these things. And so I think that's a really important differentiation, especially for any boomers who grew up during an age where it just seemed like Christians were angry, bellicose, fighting over everything. And it's like, no, 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 no. That's not what we're calling for. We're calling for unity in our comprehension of how we articulate the Christian faith publicly and amongst one another.
Yeah, that's good. And in your situation, ironically, you just had the rug pulled out from under you. But in the phone call, you were arguing. You were like, guys, you don't have to do this. Like we agree with the confession of faith. Like we have. Oh, I want unity. And then they were the ones they're like, nah, confession of faith, that doesn't matter. I just don't like you, or I
Yeah.
disagree with you. So,
Yeah.
so like, you clearly were the one fight. I mean, you didn't even have a chance to fight in this case,
Right.
really, but
Yeah.
because they just like, jumped on you so quick without warning. But, you were fighting in your own way in your private conversations, and you were resisting in whatever way you could. Although now that these things are more apparent, perhaps people will be motivated to fight in more obvious ways, more assertive ways
Yeah. Yeah. I
out in the
agree.
open.
Yeah, and I think that they can do that, and I think that it would be funny to me if, like, all of a sudden tomorrow on Twitter or on the Acts29 kind of communication channels, like 50 pastors were like, we're all going to question someone together at the same time, right? There's got to be a unified, because what they're going to do is they're going to keep
Yeah,
picking off churches that question, and so
yeah,
there's lots of tactics you can use. There's lots of strategies for reform, and it really depends on your aims. But if you really want to reform, you're going to have to find unity with other churches who are like-minded. One of the ways that I try to do that over the last 3 years is ask, like, what's the shibboleth question in the Old Testament? So my shibboleth question for a lot of people would be uh, one of two. One is, hey, what's your perspective on Russell Moore? And just,
Mm.
see how they answer. That was one question. The other question is, hey, what do you think of Doug Wilson?
Yeah.
And so those were the two easy ones in Acts 29 to ask to see
Yeah.
where somebody stands. If somebody's
Yeah.
able to, depending on your perspective, maybe you think Russell Moore's still great and Doug Wilson's still, racist, devil. Uh, that's going to tell you something. But if you are aligned, typically you're gonna be able to see their face when you say the name Doug Wilson. You're gonna see their face, and if their face melts or is horrified, then you know, okay, I don't. This isn't a guy I'm gonna lock arms with on this matter. But if it's a guy who can appreciate Wilson for what he is and has read some of his stuff, then that's a person you can work with. So you've got to have a way of discerning quickly because right now we don't have a lot of time for building relationships that are like, you know, uh, over the next 3 years, we're going to see if we can trust one another. Just
Mm.
like ask those questions. Let's see where we stand. And if we don't stand together, totally fine. But I just know I'm not going to divulge to you my thoughts on reforming the network because that's going to be weaponized against me. Because a lot of these people who hate Doug Wilson and are aligned with Russell Moore, they're very in favor of churches like mine being removed from the network. And so you will get reported on if you share anything. You're quickly going to become an outsider if you have any power at all in the system of Acts 29.
Mm. Let's make it happen. Let's have all the Acts 29 conservative churches go question Russell
Yeah.
Moore all at once tomorrow on
All
Twitter.
at once.
Man,
That'd
that'd
be
be
so
cool.
funny.
So I want to point everybody to your podcast again. It's Foolproof Theology, and you post pretty often. You have kind of similar content to the stuff that I produce here, and so I think all of my listeners would enjoy your stuff. I think your stuff is more pastoral and more academic, which is awesome. And so they can find you on YouTube. Where else can people find you?
Anywhere podcasts are found, you can go find Foolproof Theology. Apple Podcasts is where most people find it, but yeah, YouTube and podcasts are the main mediums. And we also have a Patreon page. You can go sign up and get some extra content there that most of the public doesn't get as well.
Awesome. Well, Chase, I'm saddened about your experience in Acts 29, but it seems like you're much better off now without that burden. And it's great to have you on, and it was really cool to hear your story. And hopefully, your experience is going to lead to greater and better things happening with Acts 29 in the future.
Thanks for having me on, man. It's great to be here.